Number 9. Bismarck. The German battleship Bismarck was built during the late 1930s. At one point, it was Europe's most formidable warship, yet it sank just 8 days after it hit the seas. But why? During its maiden voyage, the vessel was on a mission to intercept Allied cargo ships that were carrying supplies to Britain. It sank the legendary flagship HMS Hood in the first days of the voyage. But the victory came at a huge cost. The English were infuriated, and they retaliated against the Nazis at full force, sending the British Atlantic Navy after the Bismarck. They caught up with the German foe, and an all-out battle ensued, with the British emerging victorious. The Bismarck sank to the bottom of the sea, and it remained missing until 1989, when the wreck was discovered by Robert Ballard, the famous oceanographer who found the Titanic. It was clear, based on the wreck's pristine condition, that the warship was well built. The swastikas that had been painted on it shortly after its construction were still visible. What's even more surprising is how intact the vessel was after landing on an extinct underwater volcano and tumbling 2/3 of the way down the 3,300-foot slope. The Bismarck's hull was still intact, indicating that it was entirely flooded before it sank. If it hadn't been, then it would have imploded once it went under due to the pressure of the surrounding water. But it doesn't really matter that the ship looked so good on the ocean floor. It was useless there, and while it was a disappointment for the Nazis, it came as great news to the Allies and the rest of the world. Number 8. USS Grenadier. The American submarine USS Grenadier sank in the Straits of Malacca in 1943 after being attacked by a Japanese aircraft. A torpedo struck the vessel as it closed in on 2 Japanese cargo ships between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. After failing to repair the sub, the crew deliberately scuttled it. The Grenadier's 76 crew members were taken as prisoners aboard Japanese ships, and the sunken submarine was lost. Divers located the wreck a few years ago, sitting 280 feet below the waves. They confirmed its identity as the Grenadier by cross-referencing military records and diving to the sea floor to investigate it firsthand. Due to the vessel's depth, the team had to use a special combination of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium to breathe, and the divers could only stay at the site for a few minutes at a time. It took 5 trips to the site before the divers could say with a fair amount of certainty that the wreck's measurements matched the specifications for the Grenadier. The next step is for the U.S. Navy to officially confirm the find. 4 of the crew members who were taken prisoner by the Japanese died in captivity. The rest survived in prison camps until the war ended. The team that found the Grenadier plans to continue searching for 2 wrecked British World War II submarines that are believed to be in the area, the HMS Stonehenge and the HMS Porpoise. Number 7. Unmarked Grave and Sunken Airplane. In late September 1944, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, which sought to free the Netherlands from Nazi control and encroach on northern Germany. Thousands of paratroopers landed on key bridges and liberated several parts of the country. Somewhere between 15,000 and 17,000 soldiers died during the mission. While searching a field recently in the municipality of Best, a Dutch treasure hunter's equipment detected ammunition and a military tag belonging to a German soldier who was buried in an unmarked grave. His remains were found at the bottom of a foxhole, but there was no other body or military equipment nearby. The Salvage and Identification Service of the Royal Netherlands Army is investigating the case and may be able to identify the soldier by his identification tag. The discovery came just days after news broke that an amateur diver named Mark Sarrazin had found a World War II-era plane at the bottom of Lake Simon in Quebec. Police told the local press that Sarrazin had captured images of an object that could resemble an airplane. The Canadian Army also got involved in the investigation. Sarrazin claimed that he saw bodies and kerosene barrels on the plane and that he hit the propeller. He was unable to share images and footage of the discovery while the authorities worked to confirm it. They haven't yet announced whether Sarrazin's suspicions about it being a World War II-era plane are correct. What do you think about these discoveries? Let us know in the comments down below. Number 6. Hidden Hatch. A collection of buildings in Kent, England with a history dating back to the 1860s currently function as a girls' boarding school called the Benedin School. During World War II, however, the site served as a military hospital. A group of 4 10th grade students recently encountered an unexpected reminder of the property's past. During a study session in their recently remodeled boarding house last year, Olivia Boyce, Ella Gourier, Izzy McLean, and Haley McNally spotted a hidden hatch on the wall disguised by a wardrobe. The curious pupils moved the wardrobe out of the way and opened the mysterious door, which led to a small section of the building's eaves. 14-year-old Izzy McLean crawled into the space and found a collection of artifacts dating back to the 1940s, including candy wrappers and letters. In addition to Milky Way, Aero, and Bernaville packaging, there was a Lux soap packet, a cigarette wrapper, and matches. The most telling items are fragments of 2 letters that were likely exchanged between staff members who were stationed at the hospital. One letter, dated in 1941, was written by a woman named Betty to her sweetheart, Bobby. It includes details on how his family members were doing and updates about her life, including a mention about a recent theater visit. Speaking with reporters, Haley McNally said she thought the discovery was cool because it helps bring the property's past back to life, adding a realistic element to the history the students often hear about. She added that the girls thought about leaving a mask in the hatch so that in 30 years whoever discovered it would be reminded of the COVID era. Number 5. The Karlsruhe. In April 1940, the Nazis invaded Norway through the port city of Kristiansand, destroying its maritime defenses in a matter of hours and forcing the country's king and government to flee to Britain. To aid in their conquest, the Germans used a repurposed ship that was built in the 1920s called the Karlsruhe. The 571-foot-long swastika-bearing vessel was hit by a British submarine torpedo shortly into its return journey. Its crew evacuated, and the Nazis deliberately sank the ship 15 miles off the Norwegian coast, where it came to a rest 1,607 feet below the water's surface. The Karlsruhe is detailed in historical accounts, but the wreck's whereabouts were a mystery for around 80 years, according to maritime archaeologist Frode Kvaule, who spoke with journalists. It was finally found last year by the Norwegian power grid operator Statnett with the help of an expert, who identified the submarine in images and sonar scans. The sunken vessel was just 50 feet from a subsea power cable that the company has been operating since 1977, and it was first spotted during a routine inspection. The Karlsruhe was the last large World War II-era vessel belonging to the Germans that had remained missing. It may contain thousands of liters of oil and other hazardous materials, which experts warn could lead to an ecological disaster in the event of an attempted salvage. And while most of the Karlsruhe's crew was evacuated, it's unknown whether it will ultimately be classified as an underwater war grave. What should professionals do in a case like this one, where salvaging a wreck could potentially lead to an ecological disaster? Tell us your ideas in the comments and make sure you hit that like and subscribe to the channel. Number 4. Bunker inside a Roman fort. One of the best preserved Roman forts in Britain can be found in the Channel Islands at Alderney Nunnery. It was built during the 4th century and went on to serve as a fort and barracks during medieval times before ultimately becoming a Nazi bunker during World War II. The site's history is just now coming to light, even though excavations began during the 1930s. Archaeologists recently confirmed their long-held suspicions that the site dates back to the Roman era. They determined that it was probably built shortly before the empire collapsed. At the time, the Romans were probably in a panic as they scrambled to protect their territory against invaders. The site's 10-foot thick walls made it ideal for military use even 1,500 years after it was built. When the Germans took control of the Channel Islands in 1940, they evicted the entire population. They then built fortifications, bunkers, tunnels, and 2 forced labor and concentration camps. Evacuations are ongoing. Archaeologists recently unearthed several features that the Nazis implemented after they seized the islands, including buildings and drains. Evidence shows that the Germans installed a bunker within the walls of the Roman fort. They left one area alone completely, however. Known as the Sunroom, it may contain important details about what happened to the site after the Roman Empire collapsed. Experts have started to wonder if there was once a convent on the property. It'll take some time to figure it out as they continue to examine the history behind the jumbled mess of artifacts and buildings at the site. Number 3. 5 sunken submarines. Families of soldiers who perished in World War II-era submarine wrecks that were only recently found at the bottom of the sea are finally gaining much-needed closure. Since 2011, ocean explorer Tim Taylor and his crew have discovered 7 previously undetected sunken vessels, including 5 that disappeared during the Second World War. Included among them is the USS R-12, which went down 12 miles off the Florida Keys during a training exercise. Helen Cashel Baldwin, whose father was among those who went missing, spent 70 years longing to know exactly what happened to him and unable to properly grieve. Taylor took Baldwin and her siblings to the site and showed them drone images of the wreckage, enabling them to finally have a memorial and pay their respects. Taylor just received the Navy Distinguished Public Service Award, which is the Navy's highest civilian award for discovering the final resting places of 288 soldiers. He told NBC that he was motivated by his desire to bring comfort and closure to surviving relatives, who were left with a void from not knowing what happened to their fallen loved ones. He employed the help of autonomous robots and credits modern technology for its role in his success, but it's the genuine drive to help families that brought his mission full circle. Number 2. An out-of-place explosive. While gardening in her backyard in early May, Missouri resident Pamela Lovett noticed a rusty, mud-covered object in the ground. She took it inside and her husband, Sam Coffey, washed it off and began scraping away at it with a knife in an effort to identify what it was. Lovett noticed Japanese lettering on the item and suddenly yelled at Coffey to stop what he was doing because he might have a bomb in his hands. Using Google Lens, the couple determined that it was indeed probably a bomb. What started out as an ordinary afternoon turned chaotic when the pair called the local sheriff's office, who arrived along with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and the Air Force, Coffey told NBC News. Authorities made Lovett and Coffey wait outside the home while they set up a perimeter and investigated. Experts determined that the bomb was still live and had a 500-foot blast range. Thankfully, the St. Louis Regional Bomb and Arson Unit removed the explosive without incident while making sure to remind Lovett and Coffey how lucky they were they didn't get hurt or killed. The couple posted the shocking news on social media and it went viral. Meanwhile, the bomb was detonated in a controlled explosion at an Air Force base. Nobody knows how the foreign bomb ended up in someone's yard in America, and it's possible, perhaps even likely, that we'll never know. What are your theories on how it got there? What would you do if you found a World War II-era bomb in your garden? Tell us in the comments down below. Number 1. A rediscovered wreck. Decades after a P-38 fighter aircraft crashed in the forest near Waldeck, Austria, the U.S. Department of POW MIA Accounting Agency was finally able to investigate the site and has found possible human remains. This comes as welcome news to Bob Mitchell of Fort Smith, Arkansas, whose brother, 23-year-old Second Lieutenant Henry Donald Mitchell, was piloting the plane when it went down. While a forensic anthropologist has yet to examine the remains and verify them as being human and belonging to Henry Mitchell, the discovery offers hope to Bob, who has always wondered what happened to his brother. An email that he received about the discovery stated that the purported remains are going to be transported to a laboratory and examined for confirmation. The findings will hopefully end Bob's more than 20-year search, which began in 1997. The crash site was located in 2017, but there were delays excavating it due to complications with the landowner. American and Austrian agencies and diplomats worked together to develop the relationships necessary for gaining access to the site, but they were not permitted to dig until after the landowner passed away and his son was more open-minded to the idea. The plane's identity has been confirmed, meaning that any remains that prove to be human likely belong to Henry Mitchell. For a long time, Bob found it difficult to believe that his brother went down with the plane, especially since Henry's fellow soldiers didn't see the aircraft crash, leaving them with a lingering hope that the pilot had somehow survived, and theorizing that he was perhaps taken prisoner. But the plain and simple truth was that nobody had any way of knowing exactly what happened until now, and hopefully the forensic examination provides the answers that Bob is looking for. Number 11. Man-made space debris. Every now and then, satellites, rockets, and other objects fall out of orbit and return to Earth from space. In some cases, this is expected, but sometimes these pieces of equipment free-fall to the ground in an unplanned descent. And it happens more often than you may think. Take, for example, this rocket that crashed into the remote forest in Russia's Komi Republic back in 1992. Late last year, a Russian rocket known as the Angara launch vehicle was catapulted into space in the last of a series of demonstrations to prove its worthiness for longer and more distant missions. It flew skyward with plans to deposit a satellite into orbit and continue further on in its journey. If all went well, the Angara vehicle would replace several of the country's existing space rockets. The initial phases of the launch were successful, but things took a disappointing turn when the rocket's upper section experienced an engine failure and failed to go past a low Earth orbit. The mission was abandoned and the 20-ton spacecraft began descending toward the Earth. Experts scrambled to predict when and where it would hit in a bid to keep people safe from the impact of the uncontrolled descent. Shortly before the rocket hit, astronomer Jonathan McDowell from the U.S. Center of Astrophysics said that the worst he expected was some damage to homeowners' roofs. Thankfully, the rocket touched down in a remote part of the Pacific Ocean, far from land and people. Number 10. The Kentucky Meat Shower. One day in 1876, foul-smelling chunks of meat poured onto a field in Bath County, Kentucky from overhead. Local resident Alan Crouch recalled the bizarre incident, which happened when his wife was outside cooking soup. He said that the meat looked like beef and fell like large snowflakes during a perfectly clear sky. 3 men reportedly tasted the mysterious meat and came back with mixed reports. They couldn't agree on whether it was mutton or sheep, venison or bear meat. Some rumors claimed that the meat was the lung tissue of a baby or a horse. At least 2 histologists or tissue experts backed up these allegations. Other scientific investigations could only conclude that the material was cartilage or muscle tissue from an unknown animal. Dr. L.D. Kastenbein concluded that the downpour of flesh came from a flock of vultures, who all threw up at the same time while flying over the field. To this day, it remains the most credible theory and can even explain the meat's rancid odor, which is to be expected with the vulture's typical diet. There are two vulture species in Kentucky. Both are known for vomiting their food as a defense mechanism or to lighten themselves before flying, indicating that the residents of Bath County were most likely the victims of nothing other than bad timing. Number 9. Worms. On a calm, clear day in 2011, earthworms rained down on Scottish children while they played soccer in their schoolyard. The creepy crawlers fell in tangled bunches, softly thudding against the ground as they pelted the fields and forced the kids to end their game early. Teacher David Crichton and his co-workers recovered around 120 earthworms afterward. They turned to the school's science department, which failed to come up with an explanation for the bizarre event. Similar events were reported decades earlier in Massachusetts, Norway, and Sweden. Then in 2015, thousands of earthworms pelted the frozen ground in Norway. Biologist Karsten Erstad witnessed the mess firsthand, which left an estimated 20 worms per 10.8 square feet. At first he thought they were dead, but when he picked them up, he realized that they were very much alive. Despite being a biologist, Erstad couldn't come up with a logical explanation for the experience. After much speculation, experts determined that the worms were likely picked up by a rising pocket of warm air near the coast, carried for a short distance, and then fell back down to the earth. How would you react to a shower of worms? Share in the comments below. Number 8. Blood rain. Throughout history, there have been many reports of terrifying blood-red rain pouring down from the sky. At times, the phenomenon was blamed on a biblical plague or considered a bad omen. Answers came after people began seeking more logical explanations during the 19th century. Generally speaking, blood rain refers to rain carrying fine desert sand or other reddish particles, leaving behind a similarly colored dust in the air. It usually happens after a desert storm, and its color varies depending on the color of the sand the storm picks up. And it can travel surprisingly far. For example, the UK is known for occasionally receiving blood rain after storms in the Sahara Desert 2,000 miles away. The phenomenon is also fairly common in other parts of Europe and elsewhere in the world, including southern France and Spain, and it sometimes travels as far north as Scandinavia. During a monsoon in 2001, blood rain fell intermittently for several weeks in Kerala, India. It was reportedly strong enough to stain fabric, and it fell in various colors, including red, green, black, yellow, and brown. Experts concluded that the rain was probably caused by dust from the Arabian Peninsula. In 2018, the Siberian city of Norilsk experienced blood rain after the wind collected rust particles from a factory cleanup. And while the phenomenon can be dangerous depending on the material that a storm picks up and deposits, blood rain is usually relatively harmless. Number 7. Spiders. Australians are already used to the country's bizarre and, in many cases, utterly terrifying wildlife. But even they were surprised in 2015 when millions of spiders rained down on people's homes in the southern Tablelands region. Known as spider rain or angel hair for the silky threads the spiders leave behind, the phenomenon isn't exactly common, but it happens more often than most people would think. After catching word of the event through a Facebook post made by local resident Ian Watson, reporters contacted experts to get their take on what exactly was going on. Retired spider expert Rick Vedder explained that the strange sightings were probably the result of a transportation method called ballooning. In his words, this is a common behavior that happens when spiders climb to a high place, stick their butts up in the air, and release silk. He further explained that it happens all the time, but that people usually don't notice it because it usually occurs in far smaller numbers. Biologist Todd Blackledge explained that cases of mass ballooning likely result from many spiders being ready to take off but being delayed by the weather. Once conditions become optimal, the spiders all take to the air, making their travel much more noticeable than usual. Thankfully, the spiders that descended in Australia were deemed a non-threat to humans. Number 6. Money. The one thing that most of us wish would fall from the sky actually has for a lucky few throughout history. In 1940, 16th century rubles rained down on the Russian village of Mashera. Archaeologists determined that erosion had exposed the hoard of cash from wherever it was hidden, and that the wind had picked it up and carried it to where it fell. It also rained money in 1968 when pennies mysteriously fell over Kent, England. Many of the coins were bent, but nobody ever figured out where they came from. In 2015, a large sum of cash totaling somewhere between $544,000 and $817,000 descended into Kuwait City. The rainfall consisted mostly of 500 dirham notes, which are produced and distributed in the United Arab Emirates, and lasted for several minutes, stopping traffic as people flocked to grab up what they could. No source for the money was ever identified, and nobody stepped forth to claim it. Similar incidents of money falling from the sky have happened in Massachusetts, France, Chicago, Germany, and elsewhere, and only some of them have ever been explained. Number 5. Bats. Extreme heat waves have become an ongoing problem in Australia in recent years. When temperature rose to nearly 112 degrees Fahrenheit in 2018, a colony of gray-haired flying fox bats in Campbelltown, New South Wales began to seriously suffer from the heat. Volunteers rushed to rescue the creatures as the severe conditions fried their brains and made them incoherent. Sadly, the effort to save the bats mostly failed, resulting in the deaths of more than 204 adults and babies. As the animals perished, their carcasses fell from trees and onto the ground. Many died, but did not fall, which means that the death count was higher than the recovered bodies indicate. Young flying fox bats are more sensitive to the heat than adults. They can become endangered as soon as temperatures reach 86 degrees Fahrenheit, at which point their body starts losing the ability to regulate its temperature. The bats in Campbelltown suffered from a lack of both water and shade, which sadly hastened their demise and sent them plummeting to the ground below. The impacts of climate change are far-reaching for wildlife. Would you jump in and try to help if something like this happened near where you live? Share your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Number 4. The Oakville Blob. Rain falls on the small town of Oakville, Washington at least 275 days a year. So when it began drizzling one August morning in 1994, residents initially regarded it as just another ordinary day. But they soon realized that the rain was coming down in the form of gelatinous blobs. The torrential downpour of goo covered a 20-square-mile area 6 more times over the next 3 weeks. At the same time, people experienced severe flu-like symptoms that lasted anywhere from 7 weeks to 2 or 3 months, according to resident Beverly Roberts in a 1997 episode of Unsolved Mysteries. The show also interviewed Officer David Lacey, who claimed that the slime smeared all over his windshield when he turned his wipers on. He described the substance as very mushy and similar to Jell-O. Mike McDowell, a microbiologist with Washington Department of Health, tested samples of the material. He later said in several interviews that he believed the substance was of unnatural origin. The samples allegedly contained 2 organisms that are known to cause severe illness, but before anyone else could test them, they conveniently disappeared. When McDowell asked where the samples were, staff members reportedly responded by saying, "Do not ask." He believes that the slime was manufactured, but nobody with the ability to share the information publicly ever determined what it was or how it ended up in the rain clouds above Oakville. Number 3. Frogs. People have been reporting unexplainable rain showers of frogs throughout the world for centuries. Kansas City, Missouri was pelted with frogs during a storm in 1873. Then in 1901, frogs and toads blanketed the city of Minneapolis during a storm, leaving behind a 3-inch thick layer of amphibians across 4 city blocks. In 1991, residents of Nafplion, Greece awoke to small frogs plopping down from above. The Greek Meteorological Institute concluded that a strong wind had picked them up somewhere and then dumped them into the city. But the frog species is native to Africa, making the theory seem a little far-flung. There are dozens of other accounts of raining frogs. Many were written off as cases of the amphibians falling from overhead places like trees rather than the sky. It is scientifically possible that some of these events were caused by extreme weather like whirlwinds and tornadoes. But scientific proof is lacking, and there are plenty of doubters, including Charles Fort, an early collector of reports of strange phenomena who found it odd that nobody reported frogs missing from their pond or seeing them being swept up by the wind. While it's possible that anyone who witnessed such a strange occurrence might have been more concerned with their safety than spreading the word, Fort's argument reminds us that nobody truly knows what caused these amphibious rain showers to happen. Number 2. Golf balls. One night in 1969, during what was otherwise a normal rainfall, golf balls poured down on a neighborhood in Punta Gorda, Florida. Local papers reported that dozens and dozens and dozens of them ended up on the streets, in the sidewalk, in the gutters, and elsewhere. A team of 4 police officers tried to collect the balls, but eventually got tired of doing so because there were so many. No local golf courses were missing any balls, and little came of the incident. The most probable explanation is that a storm sucked them out of a pond and redistributed them around the town. It makes sense, especially considering the regularity at which Florida's Gulf Coast experiences extreme weather, but the theory has never been proven, and the mystery of where the golf balls came from remains unsolved. Number 1. Fish. There have been numerous reports of raining fish in various parts of the world throughout history, and while some of these cases can be explained by extreme weather, others involved fish that seemed too heavy to be picked up by powerful winds or happened out of nowhere on a perfectly clear day. During one downpour in 1966, a large fish fell onto an Australian priest as he ran across a courtyard. In 1989, at least 800 sardine-like fish rained into several homeowners' backyards during a light drizzle in Australia. A large portion of Singapore experienced a downpour of fish after an earthquake in 1861, pointing to the correlation between the two events. One of the most bizarre reports of fish rain on record came in 1956 when a couple noticed a dark cloud forming over their home in Alabama and watched in horror as several different species of live fish, including catfish and bream, showered onto their property. The strong gusts that are characteristic of tornadoes and other major storms are often powerful enough to flip cars over. Taking this into consideration, it seems plausible that the weather could be responsible for these mysterious events. But nobody knows what causes them for sure, or if these events were possibly triggered by different factors. Number 10. The Well of Hell. There's a giant pit in the country of Yemen that locals have long believed is either a prison for genies or a secret gateway into the underworld. It's known as the Well of Barhout, or the Well of Hell, and it's truly a terrifying place. In the middle of the otherwise flat and barren desert, the well is an almost perfectly circular sinkhole that seems to lead to mysterious unknowns. In truth, it's the entrance to a cave, one that was only first fully explored in 2021. A group of cave explorers from Oman recently became the first people to reach the very bottom of the infamous Well of Hell. They descended 367 feet to the bottom of the natural sinkhole in the Al-Mara province. Other cave explorers have entered the sinkhole before, but this was the first team to go all the way to the bottom. What they discovered there is pretty amazing. The explorers found 10 cave pearls, animal carcasses, live snakes, and subterranean waterfalls. The jagged floor was covered in stalagmites. It's unknown exactly how long this sinkhole has existed, but it's likely millions of years old. And because the locals have been terrified of it for centuries, it's been totally isolated from humans. The cave explorers discovered frogs, beetles, and an entire ecosystem living in isolation from the rest of the world in an underground oasis you'd never expect to find under the sandy surface of the desert. Number 9. Sunken ship from World War II. During World War II, German submarine commanders started attacking merchant shipping vessels along the eastern coast of the United States of America. It proved to be one of their worst decisions because it was what ultimately dragged the United States into the war against the Axis powers. One of the ships destroyed by the Germans during these attacks was the American steam tanker called Dixie Arrow. It was struck by a torpedo on March 26, 1942, and then it gradually sank to the bottom of the ocean. Over 75 years later, National Geographic created a special program called Drain the Oceans. Using sonar technology and deep ocean scans, the project showed what the bottom of the ocean would look like if the water was gone and it was turned into a desert. What was revealed on their program was a hypothetical landscape covered in hundreds upon hundreds of giant vessels amidst the rock and sand of this new desert. The Dixie Arrow, which was once a merchant vessel carrying 86,000 barrels of oil, would be like a mountain of rusted metal rising from the dust. Number 8. Tobacco in Utah. Even though it's beginning to fall out of favor with the younger generations in modern times, humankind has been addicted to tobacco for roughly 12,500 years. In the middle of the Utah desert, archaeologists recently found what they believe to be evidence of the earliest use of wild tobacco. The researchers found coyote tobacco at the Wishbone site in northwestern Utah. The seeds of the tobacco plant were found scattered around an ancient hearth in the Great Salt Lake Desert, not exactly somewhere you picture ancient Native Americans sitting around and having a chew. But thousands of years ago, the desert was a lake, and an area rich with both wildlife and prehistoric humans living in its marshes. The ancient people didn't use tobacco in the form of cigarettes or cigars, but instead nibbled on tobacco plants, somewhat similar to the way that some people chew tobacco today. Based on the evidence, humans sat around the fire and chewed wild tobacco plants to get a release of nicotine, granting them a quick dopamine high. We knew humans did this about 3,500 years ago, but this has come as a total shock. It's pushed the date of humans using nicotine back over 9,000 years. Number 7. The Desert Crop Circle. The Desert Breath, an art installation in Egypt, looks eerie and confusing when viewed from the ground. Rising out of the flat and empty vastness of the Egyptian desert, these look like perfectly symmetrical alien anthills, with matching pits for each hill nearby. So what is this place exactly? Desert Breath is an art installation that was completed in 1997. Conical protrusions and conical depressions were made along the desert floor here in one of the biggest and most impressive modern geoglyph projects ever undertaken. On the ground, it doesn't look like anything important. It's not until you see it from above that you understand that the 89 cones and their 89 matching depressions create a mesmerizing spiral. They make a pair of geometrically matching arms that start at a central axis and spin away from each other farther and farther. It's a feat of mathematical precision that took modern technology to complete. The desert crop circles, as some call them, were designed to erode back into the desert sands. In just a few years, the whole thing will be gone. Are you interested in seeing desert breath before it disappears? Let me know in the comments down below. Number 6. Sea cows. Fascinating art projects aren't the only thing hiding in the Egyptian desert. Researchers have also come across the fossilized remains of sea cows. As you probably know already, the dry desert of Egypt was once completely underwater around 35 million to 40 million years ago. It was a time when swimming above the desert floor were the ancient relatives of manatees and dugongs, also known as sea cows. Scientists recently found a small collection of fossils that were once part of a creature belonging to the ancient family of Sirenia. This is an order that includes all dugongs, manatees, and their extinct relatives. It was a bit of a surprise for scientists who had never before found a Sirenia fossil in this area, the Beni Suef Formation. They discovered its ribs, some pieces of vertebrae, and limb bones back in 2019. But here's something that will really surprise you. Just like ancient whales, prehistoric sea cows once lived on land. They had legs and walked around, but gradually slipped into the ocean and became marine animals. The oldest known sirena ever found was in Jamaica, dated at 50 million years old. It was a semi-aquatic beast with hind limbs. Have you ever seen a manatee or dugong in real life? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe before the end of the video. Number 5. The Azkala Fortresses. The Azkala is a complex archaeological site in Uzbekistan, located at the very edge of the Kizilkum Desert. It was part of the defensive line of fortresses built in a barren wasteland to defend the agricultural settlements beyond. The forts were built to keep out nomadic raiders that used to roam across the desert, as well as to keep the nomadic Saka who lived in the Eurasian steppe from taking advantage of the rich and fertile oasis created and maintained by the locals. The fortresses were built over a period of about 1100 years, from the 4th century BC until the 7th century AD. The first is called Azkala I, a ruin sitting on a rocky outcrop. It was used not only as a defensive fortress, but also to house the people all the way into the medieval period. There are 2 other major fortresses, both of them hardly standing. But what's really interesting is that looking at them now, they don't appear to be protecting anything. Hundreds of miles in every direction is a wasteland, and it's hard to imagine anyone who would have lived there. That's just how quick landscapes can change, in even just a few centuries. Number 4. The Geoglyphs of the Thar Desert. The largest geoglyphs in the world were discovered in India's Thar Desert. The geoglyphs here have been described as the largest geometrical painting made by human hands ever. It's a massive spiral artwork covering a vast distance of roughly 51 acres. In one direction, the geoglyphs go on for 30 miles, reaching nearly to the border of Pakistan. The geoglyphs were formed using both earth and stone and are far larger than the Nazca lines in Peru. Researchers don't know why these lines were made in the desert, but they definitely weren't meant to be pictures of animals or figures. Instead, the geoglyphs are all geometric patterns. One interesting point is that several rock burials have been found within the space of the geoglyphs. Archaeologists also found several memorial stones carved with images of Hindu deities such as Krishna and Ganesh. The lines could have been used in some kind of grand ceremony or for some Hindu celebration. Like other geoglyphs, however, the exact purpose or function remains a mystery. These amazing, massive, record-breaking geoglyphs were only discovered in 2014 thanks to Google Earth. We still don't know exactly how old they are, but some estimates put them at being made as recently as 200 years ago. That's kind of shocking considering nobody knows anything about them. You'd think such a huge project constructed only 2 centuries ago would be remembered. Number 3. The California Viking Ship. Somewhere deep in the Colorado Desert of California, there may or may not be a buried treasure ship left behind by the Vikings. Some say the ship is nothing but a legend. Others believe in it wholeheartedly. Some have even claimed to see the ship with their own eyes, its wooden timbers jutting through the sand like the corpse of some prehistoric wooden beast. One of the people who say they saw the ship was a librarian named Myrtle Botts. In 1933, when she was hiking with her husband through the desert, she came across a ship stuck in the rocky face of Cannebrake Canyon. It was made of wood, it had decorations on its flanks that looked to be Viking, and it had a serpent carved on its prow. What's really crazy is that Myrtle said the ship was so high up that neither she nor her husband could reach it. It looked as though it had crashed into the cliff. But before Myrtle and her husband could return with help, an earthquake shook California, the rock was dislodged, and the ship was buried. There have been other sightings of the ship since then, lost under a heap of sand and stone. But nobody's ever actually dug it out of the desert. Most people don't even believe it's there, and you can't really blame them. After all, how in the world could the Vikings have gotten a ship all the way to California? What do you think? Is it somehow possible for a Viking ship to have made its way to the California desert? Could it be part of an abandoned movie set? Or is the whole thing simply a tall tale? Let us hear your theories down below. Number 2. Aboriginal Australians. Shocking new information has pushed back occupation of the Australian desert 25,000 years. Archaeological work at a rock shelter at the desert site of Carnatukul, which used to be known as Serpent's Glen, proves that the Aboriginal Australians were living in the middle of the desert in Western Australia for over 50,000 years. The site of the rock shelter was 620 miles from the coastline all that time ago, and was still a desert even back then. It's bizarre because it means the original native people of the continent settled along the shore, then preferred to go into the wastelands and live in the scorching heat. The site of Carnatukul was first investigated in the 1990s and was then considered to be the oldest site in the Australian desert, occupied 25,000 years ago. But when researchers went back just recently and started looking at artifacts, rock art panels, and using modern radiocarbon dating, it became clear that the site is much older than originally believed. Researchers had over 25 stone artifacts to analyze, as well as charcoal from ancient hearths, animal bones, and pigments used in stone paintings. By far the strangest part, though, and what scientists can't understand, is the fact that they were living in the desert at all. Why would they choose to live in the blistering hot, arid zone when they could have settled near the warm, balmy coastline with more abundant resources? Perhaps there's more to this story yet to be discovered. Number 1. The Rock Engravings of Namibia. The Twiffelfontein rock engravings in Namibia are fascinating. They date back to the Stone Age and are spectacular petroglyphs that show animals and the daily activities of hunter-gatherers who created them. This place became a UNESCO site in 2007, but had already been a major national monument for Namibia since 1952. The main reason this is such a cool site is that it boasts the largest concentration of Stone Age rock engravings in all of Africa. There are over 2,500 pictures carved into over 200 sandstone blocks, with the oldest dating back over 6,000 years. This was a time when the African desert was overflowing with nomadic tribes. It's believed the engravings were made by the Khoikhoi nomads, the second group of humans believed to have occupied the area. They made the petroglyphs to depict the animals they hunted, primarily elephants, ostriches, antelopes, and even giraffes. One of the reasons they felt compelled to draw all this stuff had to do with their belief in spirits. The Bushmen felt it was necessary to record the animals they killed and to document their ritual practices. They believed each animal had a special spiritual quality. For example, elephants and wildebeest were closely connected to water, while other animals had different spiritual connections. Etching the animals in stone was a way for the Khoikhoi to tell their story and keep their beliefs immortalized. If you could journey to just one desert on Earth, which would you choose? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and come back again soon for another awesome video right here on American Eye.